Blunt's getting his mail forwarded now to the First Rule Broadcast and Film Studios. That's our new studio here. Good morning, Senator Blunt. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning,
It looks
Senator.
like you do it all here. You've got the band set up, and you've got obviously the cameras everywhere.
Yeah.
And,
State of the art.
radio's not what it used to be. That's all I can say.
It's everything's changing. As you sit and you watch Ferguson, you're back and forth. You hear you're on the outside and you're on the inside. You have a unique perspective. What are your thoughts as you watch all this?
Well, I'll tell you, it's one of those things that since August, anywhere you are in the country, you're likely to run into somebody and you say you're from Missouri, or they know you're from Missouri, and
Right.
they say, boy, we're concerned about what's happening in Ferguson. And I think there's a sense that this could happen in so many places in the country, that this same potential is there all over the country. And that's some of the concern that people have is how do we stop that from happening where we live, where you've got there's a real opportunity gap and there's a preparation gap. And one of the things, the first thing I think I had to say about this, which was the day it happened or the day after it happened, McGraw, was that Michael Brown had done something that most of the people he grew up with hadn't done, which was figure out how to graduate from high school. And
Right.
the tragedy of not being able to go on is one of the many tragedies of this situation. But people see that. And if you're not from where we live, you have a hard time perceiving how these communities all work together. You've got 90 communities
Right.
in a 1 million population county, and what that all means. And it's
There's
concerning.
no question that the outside people drop in, think they know what they're talking about, but it takes years to sort of figure out how the whole system works, and takes years to figure out what the best way to move forward is. But going forward, Senator, there's an underlying fear here in the region that if the decision comes back one way or the other, there might be real violence going forward. What do you say to that? And are the leaders figuring out a way to make this announcement in a way in which that doesn't happen?
Well, I think there's a lot of discussion and thought about that topic, and I've always thought that the 3 investigations going on have real potential to, at the end of this tragedy, or at the end of trying to figure out what happens, to convince people that there is a common sense of what happens here. There's not just one group looking at this, but you've got the county police investigating. I've not been a believer that the federal government can come in and take over local responsibilities, but after Chief Belmer and Charlie Dooley called for the Justice Department to help, I was immediately on the phone with them saying, it looks like to me that having you here helps verify at the end of the day whatever facts people have to pull together. And at some point, everybody's not going to be satisfied with this, but a universal understanding of the facts are going to lead to one conclusion or the other.
Do you think we need better leadership going forward? We had mentioned there were so many violent protests taking place, and we felt like we sat here and we thought, where are the leaders? Who's controlling this? Who's sending a message, to stop the violence and protest peacefully? Do you think there's a need for that?
Well, I've spent quite a bit of time with legislators from the area. I talked to Tommy Pearson again, a pastor there who's also a state legislator yesterday, with a lot of discussion with various ministers in the community, both African American ministers and ministers from outside the community who've come in and actually become a pretty active part of what they hope to be a peaceful protest. And leaders are clearly emerging that weren't seen as community leaders before, but this is a place where, back to the early discussion, you wouldn't assume this would happen in one of these communities, small communities in St. Louis County, and become such a focus, a regional focus. And people have come in. I think that the early agitators appear to not be there on any consistent basis now. And I think there's a real appreciation that there has been efforts to try to be sure that people could protest, that people could express their concern about this, and hopefully we can figure out how to build on that.
It seemed as though we were able, on many occasions, to keep the violence to a minimum, if not stop it, and then that, overnight it just turned around, and now it's almost as though we can't even have a peaceful protest.
Well, I'm not sure that I think the tempo is changing dramatically. You have things happen that have been happening now since the middle of August, and sometimes a spark sort of occurs. What you don't have right now, I don't believe, are the citizen on citizen violence. Lots of shots fired, hundreds of shots fired in that week after Michael Brown was shot. 8 or 9 people shot, all civilians shot by other civilians. The police there and eventually had to bring in some bulletproof defensive vehicles to rally around and to get some of these, at least one of these civilians got out of a situation where if they hadn't had the vehicle they had, there was no way an ambulance would have ever gotten in to get the person out who again was shot by somebody else. So that out-of-control violence that could have been much more tragic than it even was seems to me to be at a different level of control. But I think we all anticipate that whenever the grand jury makes an announcement, either way, you're going to have
It's our fear.
a reaction to that.
Let's move on. What Senate race are you watching here closely?
Well, I'm watching a bunch of them, and there are about 10 of them to watch. The 7 in states that the president didn't carry. I noticed yesterday, I just read in a paper this morning, he made a comment yesterday about how all of these senators were actually people who had supported his policies,
right,
and they were on his team. And this is almost like the week ago when he said, I may not be on the ballot, but my policies are. And in the 7 states the president didn't carry that have Democrats in the Senate right now, he's less popular in every one of those states than the 2 times he didn't carry 6 of them, and the 1 time he didn't carry North Carolina. And then I think if you have something outside of just sort of the normal, who's the map to the advantage of happen, Colorado, Iowa, and even New Hampshire are clearly states election night. And depending on what happens in Michigan, if the Republican governor's reelected by enough votes in Michigan, that could be an 11th state to watch.
What percentage?
2 weeks from today.
What percentage do you put at the Republicans taking over the Senate?
I'm not particularly good at that, but everything I read says about, there are people who do that and do that pretty much for a living, and
right,
they're all saying now somewhere between 60 and 65%. But if anybody can mess this up, my side has the total capacity to here at the last minute to figure out how to turn 65% into 25%.
You mean you guys are good at snatching defeat from the jaws of victory?
We have proven a couple of times in a row that we could do that. But one thing it's not, we got good candidates out there, and it's the 6th year of the presidency is what it is, and the off-year elections are always about the president one way or another. And interestingly, the president's making this more about him rather than less about him every time he talks about the election.
Well, we still have you here to quickly talk about Ebola. So many people talking about it, so much oxygen being used up on it. How worried as Americans should we be over Ebola?
I think a couple of points I'd want to make there. One is that, we had a couple of missionaries come back, and they had Ebola, and they went to Emory University Hospital, and a couple of weeks later, or however long it was, they were released. Nobody said anything about this. It's only when the system appears not to be working that Americans get concerned that the system's not working. I don't know why the learning curve was so slow here, but it was. I had was a hospital event last night. I was with a bunch of hospital administrators, and their view was that their hospitals and others are much better prepared for this than they were a month ago. But I think we have to ask ourselves, why weren't we talking about this a month ago? It seems like the government particularly and the society generally is about a half a step behind right now, and that concerns people that the institutions they count on, starting with the federal government, just don't seem to be working. At the federal level, it's not just the Center for Disease Control. It's the IRS can't find their records, and the Secret Service can't appear to protect the White House, and kids at the border are a problem. And it happens. So many of these things happen, you can't even keep track of what it is you're supposed to be concerned about.
Do you support a travel ban?
I do. Now, the way I would do, first of all, we don't have any flights from those countries, so to some extent, we don't control what might eventually happen in Paris or Brussels or somewhere that these flights normally come from. But all of these countries, these Western African countries, you have to have a visa to come here. And I would suspend giving those visas out until, and I'd suspend the visas that are out until we figure out if this is really under control and what kind of process an individual needs to go through before you give them the piece of paper that they need to ultimately get on the plane in somewhere else, or so they can get off the plane here. I think we have to get containment is how you handle this. And these African countries that we can help. I was in Liberia a year ago in August, and this is a country that was almost totally destroyed by Charles Taylor when he ran it. Nobody in the country 10 years ago when he finally left office had electricity unless you had your own generator. And this is not because they'd never had electricity. It's just because he let the whole country disintegrate. I think the average annual income 10 years ago was $36 or $39 annual income. And so, very, very stressed in how to deal with this, even though they've got a government that has come a long way in 10 years, but a long way for them is still difficult. And how do you help them contain it? And how do you be sure that we contain it? And I'd suspend those visas until we figure out whether we've got this under control or not. And for healthcare workers and others coming back, they don't have to have a visa, but we ought to be really sure that we're asking the right questions at both ends of that trip. So that we don't have this. And, we had good news yesterday for the country when over 40 people that had been in contact with Mr. Duncan they got beyond the point where they're no longer at risk.
Right.
And so that means the people they saw, they are never going to be at risk, and that's all working in the right direction. But again, why did we have people on airplanes who had fevers, who now have Ebola? What are we doing here that we should have done differently and we should learn from?
Senator Roy Blunt, always a pleasure. You're always welcome here.
Hey,
thanks for coming in. And
great to be here. And my mail had stacked up a little bit because I couldn't find the new studio, but now I've got it.
Things happen. Be safe out there. Thank you, sir.
Good to see you.
646 traffic, weather, sports, straight ahead, and markets next.